you referenced EU actions, but the EU actions, some of which you read, are nowhere in line with the sanctions that we have levied against Iran. That's a fair statement, right?
No, it's not true, because
the EU has the same set of sanctions as we have against Iran?
The EU, unfortunately, and this is one of the weaknesses of the deal, is that the European Union, I think...
Mr. Hook, I'm sorry, you're an excellent lawyer, and you've developed the expertise of the State Department to go on and on without being specific to an answer to a question. I have a very simple question. Do the EU sanctions line up with our sanctions against Iran? Yes or no?
Yes, they sanctioned Iran.
So they have all the sanctions we have.
No. I didn't know.
That's what I mean.
You had asked
They're
me.
not as strong as the United States sanctions. You before heralded that our sanctions were more powerful and more consequential than when we had the EU with us.
Oh, that's true.
The EU sanctions are not the same as ours.
But they are, I think, complementary, because
I didn't ask you if they're complementary. I asked you, are they the same as ours? What is so difficult about that answer?
I never said they're the same.
Okay.
I'm happy to review the transcript. I never said that.
There are a series of EU sanctions that were EU sanctions and actions. That have.
No, I said European.
I said
European.
Let me finish.
I didn't say EU.
I get to ask the questions. You get to answer them.
Happy to.
The EU's actions do not equate to the sanctions that the United States has levied against Iran. That is a fair statement, is it not?
Can you repeat it so that I understand it precisely?
The EU actions do not equate to the sanctions the United States has levied against Iran. Is that fair?
They don't equate, and I never said they equate.
Okay, all right, fine. Now, you also said that Iran has a history of coming to the table because of sanctions. I was the author of most of those sanctions. The reality is, however, those sanctions were multilateralized by the European Union and others, and therefore the magnitude of the consequence was greater. That brought them to the table. But your sanctions unilaterally have not brought them to the table. You talked about having diplomatic leverage in Syria to deal and thwart Iran from where we want them. Well, the president just made a statement that Russia's expansion after the U.S. departs is fine, and all they're fighting over there is a lot of sand. Well, when you have 14,000 to 18,000 ISIS fighters, when you have another 10,000 that were imprisoned by the Kurds that may be released, several hundred have already been released, and regroups with them, that's about more than a lot of sand. When you create a land bridge for Iran to come into Syria and attack our ally, the State of Israel, that's about a lot more than sand. So I don't know what leverage you're referring to that we have in Syria, because we have outsourced Syria to Russia. And talking about reconstruction funds as our leverage, not only is it years away, but I'm sure others will fill the void economically with Syria when and if that time ever comes, because they already have a big stake in it, i.e. Russia, just to mention a few. So we don't really have any leverage in Syria. That which we have, we just expended. So my question is, at what point, if Iran continues to enrich and do all the things that you admitted they were doing as a result of them feeling that we walked away and they have no obligation anymore, if they continue to do that, at what point will the size and sophistication of Iran's nuclear program force the administration to consider whether military action is necessary to restrain Iran's nuclear program?
I think that question is probably best left to a classified briefing.
Well, without getting into the specifics, have you come to such a determination?
A determination of what?
As to what is the size and sophistication of Iran's nuclear program that would force the administration to consider military action?
We have...
Without getting into what it is, have you come to a conclusion of what the dimensions
are? In an unclassified setting, I can't have that discussion. I'm happy to have it privately.
This is a simple answer that has nothing to do with classification.
Oh, it does, because you've asked how close is Iran to a nuclear weapon, and you've also asked about the military.
That's all a matter of public information. I don't need you to testify to that or to speak to it. I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you, have you come to a conclusion that if Iran reaches X dimension and X sophistication, that will cause the necessity for a military action because sanctions haven't worked?
Our military is always prepared for any contingency.
Right, that's not an answer. Finally, you agree that the full enforcement of sanctions on Iran is incredibly important, right?
Correct, yeah.
And in our sanctions regime, it's weaker when people figure out how to evade them to the benefit of Iran. Is that not a fair statement?
Correct.
And do you believe that those who seek to evade U.S. sanctions on Iran should be prosecuted or fined to the fullest extent of the law?
That is our policy, yes. We will sanction any sanctionable behavior.
So in the case of Reza Zarrab, who ran the biggest sanctions evasion scheme in recent history, in which Turkish gold was traded for Iranian oil, he paid off Turkish government officials as well as officials at the Turkish Halk Bank to facilitate the transactions. Erdogan, who was the prime minister at the time, reportedly knew about the scheme. Zarrab was arrested in March of 2016 by U.S. authorities and then hired Rudy Giuliani and former Attorney General Michael Mukasey to represent him. You've testified here that General Mukasey asked you to come see you. When he asked to come see you, did you know that Rudy Giuliani was going to accompany him?
I don't recall if that was mentioned. I just know that he was there.
He was there. He just showed up. So when he came the second time, did you know that he was going to accompany Mr. Mukasey?
I may or may not have. I'm not sure how it's material. I just honored the request of General Mukasey to do a meeting, and I did the meeting, and then no action was taken.
Well, the price must have been right because both were willing to put their reputations on the line to represent someone who worked so hard to undermine U.S. national security interests. Are you familiar with the report that the Washington Post had that both Mr. Giuliani and Mukasey directly appealed to the president to exchange Zarrab for an imprisoned American in the fall of 2017 in an Oval Office meeting that included then Secretary Tillerson?
I haven't read the Post story, and I'm not aware of the meeting.
You're not aware of the meeting. Mr. Tillerson never spoke to you about such an effort. The October 10th report also says, as you've stated before, that Mr. Giuliani, in addition to Mr. Mukasey, met with you to discuss the case at the State Department. Is that true?
There were two meetings early in the administration.
And it was about Mr. Zarrab, right?
I haven't said that. I just said it was on a consular issue.
Well, first of all, a consular issue is about visas. It's about whether or not a visa has been given for a visitor's visa, for work permit, for investor permits. That's a consular issue. You're trying to hide behind the term consular issue when this was a meeting about someone who was in prison seeking to evade U.S. sanctions on Iran through Turkey. That's not a consular issue.
It was presented as a consular issue.
That's not a consular issue.
But it was presented as a consular issue.
Well, I could call a dog a cat. That doesn't mean that it ultimately is a cat, right? I can call it anything to try to avoid it, but that doesn't mean that's what it is.
The meeting did concern a consular proposal, and it was not acted upon. I think anybody who knows me knows that I rigorously enforce all sanctions against Iran.
When we have the highest office in the land empowering people to seek to make a deal, when you have the biggest violator of U.S. sanctions on Iran, it's hard to believe that we have a universal message on Iran that our sanctions will be vigorously enforced and preserved. And so it breaks credibility at the end of the day.
I don't see how it does. We've had in place, there is no administration in history that has imposed more sanctions on Iran than this administration. There is no historic precedent for greater enforcement of our sanctions, and there was nothing that impacted our sanctions at all as a consequence of those two meetings.
Mr. Zarrab was the biggest violator of U.S.-Iran sanctions of any single individual. Is that not true?
In the prior administration, yes, and he's in jail.
the bottom line
I don't know what else there.
but
I mean, we're enforcing
the bottom
our
line
sanctions.
is, but it wasn't.
Halk Bank
it
is
wasn't
being
the prior
prosecuted.
administration who was letting free agents go to make a deal to let him loose.
I didn't make any deal.
Come on, stop with that prior administration stuff.
No, but this is a question for.
This is a question that you met with them, not the prior administration.
No,
you met with them
and then took no action. So we're in full agreement on this that we need to vigorously enforce our sanctions, and we have.